On March the 25th, 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech on the steps of the Alabama State Legislature. And the speech was at the conclusion of the 54-mile Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. Does anybody have a memory here of that? I'm sure some of you do. You're dating yourself, of course. And word is that there were about 25,000 people present on that day in March of 1965. And the title of Dr. King's speech was, "How Long, Not Long." And in that speech, King quoted words of Theodore Parker, who was a 19th century Unitarian minister and abolitionist. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Words of wisdom made famous by arguably the greatest black preacher in history. Of course, there are countless words of wisdom from famous people across all generations, and I'm sure that some of them have inspired you in your journey. I know some of you receive the daily minutes from our friend Paul Ivany, who has done a number of pieces of work with our church. He's from Norval, Ontario, and his minutes reach 3,000 or 4,000 people every day. And at the end of Paul's daily minutes every day, there's a little section called Words of Wisdom. But my question for us today is, are there personal words of wisdom that have been spoken to you by people in your life that nobody else knows about? They're not famous people. They've never made a headline. And perhaps you've all but forgotten the person, but you remember their words. They've stuck with you. When I was 17, I did a high school co-op placement at the local bank. And back in those days, here I'm dating myself, most of a bank teller's work was with a calculator and a pencil and a deposit slip. And before you could open up your wicket for the day's work, before the customers arrived, there was some work to do to get ready. And I remember just a few days into this new placement, and I was busily trying to do the paperwork that was supposed to be done before we opened the doors. And the opening time came, and I wasn't quite ready, and so I was trying very hastily to try to finish the work. And the bank manager, who was a very nice, kind man, he was walking by, and he had a look at me, and he just smiled at me, and he said 4 words that have stuck with me for 30 years. "The paper can wait." Do you know, I think about that every time I'm in a situation where people are waiting for someone to finish whatever is deemed to be more important than them. The paper can wait. So what about you? Are there words of wisdom that have stuck in your memory? I remember in my last church at one point, we were struggling with a fairly major issue, and we had invited someone from the regional office, the head office in London, to come down and help us out, and they had to drive an hour and a half to get to our meeting. And the chairperson of the group started out by saying, "Well, we'll get started right away. Your time is precious and we don't want to keep you." And the chair was addressing this person that had driven an hour and a half. And the person from the office very graciously replied, "Your time is as valuable as mine." Words of wisdom. We make assumptions about time, of course. We think that the time of people in certain roles or jobs or positions is more valuable than ours, or maybe we think that our time is more valuable than theirs. But words of wisdom, all of our time is valuable. So in those 2 examples, it sort of bent the arc for me. It flattened the hierarchy, if you will. And I think that's what Paul seems to address as the next topic of concern that we're working our way through in Corinthians these last few Sundays. Last week, Paul concluded that his primary task was to preach rather than to baptize. Quite a radical statement, I thought, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its power. And so today he's picking up on that piece and he wants to say a little bit more about it. And as the letter continues, Paul quotes God's words as recorded in the prophet Isaiah. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. And then he asks a question. Well, where is the one who's wise? Could someone please put their hand up? And that guides the rest of what Paul says on the topic. We're looking for the wisdom, the one who's wise. Where is that one? Where is wisdom? Because the wisdom of God looks quite different than what we might expect. Now, Paul loves rhetorical questions. It doesn't take long for us to discover that, particularly in this first letter to the Corinthians. And we hear another good one today. Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? And of course the answer is supposed to be, well, yes. But he puts the question out there to get people thinking. So before we go too far with Paul, let's consider just for a minute what wisdom might be here. And it's helpful to know a bit more about the Corinthians. Most of them were not high class by worldly standards, even back then. They were ordinary people who worked hard, had families, they just wanted to do the best they could with what they had. And the issue that Paul is encountering is that some of the Corinthians thought that human knowledge was the only way to assess things, the sole measuring rod of all things, including faith and religion. And some of them were using human reason to evaluate this Christian message that Paul is proclaiming. And so he's becoming concerned about this. And he pens some of the most famous words ever written later in the letter to the Corinthians. Knowledge will come to an end. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. There are more important measures of faith than knowledge. And fundamentally, he's suggesting it is wisdom, divine wisdom, wisdom that is of and from God, wisdom that transcends human knowledge. And so for Paul, God's wisdom is revealed in the cross, a greater wisdom than humanity could ever bespeak, because Jesus himself becomes for us wisdom from God, and so we look to Jesus as the primary way that wisdom is revealed. And what do we find? We find things we may not necessarily expect. That the sign of our redemption is right there lying in a manger, a child. We find a little later that a servant Christ is washing feet at a supper. We find one who wears a purple robe of mockery and goes all the way to death, even death on a cross, to make the ultimate point about true wisdom. Oh, we often talk about it being as a sacrificial act. There is of that, of course, but Paul is setting it up as the ultimate act of wisdom. It's almost as though in the early words to the Corinthians, Paul is setting up the whole narrative of the Passion. I hadn't actually thought about it that way before until I was working with it this week. And so all of this, of course, points me to the question for our time: what do words of wisdom sound like today? The paper can wait. Your time is as valuable as mine. You see, amid all the noise and the distraction and, quite frankly, the abuse of power that we see at work in so many corners, what does wisdom sound like? Well, I think that's where the Beatitudes come in. God's wisdom looks like the poor in spirit, inheriting the kingdom of God. Wisdom looks like those who mourn, being comforted. Wisdom looks like the meek, inheriting the earth. Wisdom looks like those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, being filled. Wisdom looks like the merciful receiving their due. Wisdom looks like the pure in heart seeing God. Wisdom looks like the peacemakers being called children of God. And yes, wisdom also looks like those who are persecuted receiving God's kingdom. And from the Beatitudes, I think that we can make the following observations about what words of wisdom sound like. So here are 4 that I found. Words of wisdom start with good listening. You see, right after his baptism, Jesus spends time in the wilderness for 40 days, the time that we will observe in the season of Lent coming up. And he travels throughout Galilee, teaching and preaching and healing. So presumably, Jesus had already listened a lot. And then he speaks the words. So words of wisdom seem to begin with good listening. And then it seems they're not about the person who is speaking them. Oh, we're all guilty of this, aren't we? I hear it every day. Someone will start to talk about something, and then before you know it, it's back on the other person, redirecting the conversation from them to me. But Jesus is speaking about them, the disciples, their faith, their journey, their blessing. That's wisdom. They start with good listening. They're not about the person speaking them. And thirdly, they're rooted in an experience of serving and sometimes even suffering. Jesus was, above all, servant Lord. So much of what St. Paul writes is after he had been himself persecuted. Some of his writing is from prison. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech in Alabama was given after he had spent time in jail. We could speak of Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Mother Teresa or Oscar Romero or any number of other people. Deep wisdom is rooted in experiences of suffering and servanthood, because the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And finally, words of wisdom sound like the truth, even if it is not the common narrative. And that's really what I think Paul is getting at in the letter, that because most people are saying something doesn't necessarily mean it's the core of the matter. Sometimes the wisdom is found on the margins, because that's where the need is. That's where the suffering is. I mean, the Beatitudes certainly aren't what you hear in today's world politics. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. They're spoken to those on the margins, because that's where wisdom lies. That's where God resides. Words of wisdom start with good listening. They're not about the person speaking them. They're rooted in experiences of serving and suffering, and they sound like the truth, even if it isn't popular or prevalent. Oh, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does bend toward justice. And sometimes at various points in history, it might even seem like it is bending backward. But the arc is long. It's forever bending. And prophetic wisdom always helps it bend just a little bit further.